idea that on Thursday we were going to have like 8 people here in class because of the weather, but we had like 21. And now today's a really nice day and we only got 10 people. I haven't figured out a pattern yet.
I think it's sporadic. I don't know. I have 2 jobs, so my schedule's like this. Honestly, last Thursday I woke up at 9 o'clock and I was like, oh.
It's okay.
Dang it.
Well, today we're going to get ready to start. We're going to cover one of my favorite topics. Again, to kind of recap and remind us of where we've been and how we got to where we're at. I guess technically the last 2 weeks, we have talked about ethical leadership, and we've started this new paradigm of leadership theories that we call process theories. So we've gone from trait to behavior to, I call them contingencies, but what did we call them? My brain just blanked. But all of our contingency theories to now this idea of process, that we've started talking about the fact that leadership is not just about the leader, but it does include followers. It includes some context. But just looking at those things isn't really answering all of our questions about the process as a whole. And so last 2 weeks, we talked about ethical theory and how now we're going to start pulling in some of these other contingencies. And the contingency that was brought in with ethical leadership were these ideas of ethics in leadership. So we're not quite at the point of morality yet, because remember we talked about what's the difference between ethics and morality. Morality tends to lie more on values and beliefs. Ethics is kind of just this sense of what's right or wrong, right? It's a little bit more black and white. We had 3 ethical theories. Then we had this idea of what toxic leadership looks like. So the toxic triangle. And then the principles of ethical leadership. Today, we're going to discuss transformational leadership theory. So again, the thing about these process theories is they're not quite as prescriptive as everything that we've had up to this point. You know, we're not necessarily going to come out with a style that we say, if you lead in this way, you can expect this type of outcome. It's more going into a classroom, going into a business, observing what happens, talking to people about, well, what makes you think this person's a good leader or not? Why are they effective? And we kind of start to build this model for a process of leadership that can potentially be used. So transformational leadership is kind of one of these first processes that we're talking about. So again, we're in this new leadership paradigm. We've moved past things. There's 2 new elements to leadership that we're going to start to consider. We're going to start considering this idea of charismatic. It goes a little bit back to trait theory, but again, what is charisma? When you say someone has charisma, how do you describe them?
Like they're people savvy.
Yeah. They're people savvy. How else? You want to be around them. There's just like something about them just kind of draws you in like a moth to a flame, right? What else makes someone charismatic?
They're usually pretty enthusiastic.
Oh yeah. They're enthusiastic. Whatever they're talking about, like, they get people on board. They have a way to do that, right? Good speakers. I mean, a lot of times, like, there's a difference between a charismatic speaker and a person that's not a charismatic speaker, right? That idea of drawing you in. And then effective. When we say effective, you notice it's with an A, not an E. What does effective with an A mean?
Oh man, I don't know.
How you feel. We're starting to talk about feelings, y'all. We're going to talk about feelings. So, you know, you may hear about effective in education settings sometimes, that like cognitive is how people think. But then if you want people to learn on an effective level, you want to dial into their feelings. How do they feel about things, right? So People learn both effectively and cognitively. There's also a third one. My ag ed people, what's the third way people learn? We have effective, cognitive, tactile learning, doing. So doing, thinking, feeling, right? So transformational leadership is going to be kind of one of these first theories that we are getting more into how people feel. Who in here likes talking about their feelings? Thank you for being honest, Ashley. I talk about them a little bit more than I'm getting older. But here's the thing. This new paradigm overall, so again, it's how we're thinking about leadership rather than what we do. So we're describing this process. This is going to sound a little crazy, but transformational leader theory, 3 big things we're going to talk about with it. There's kind of, if we want to call them styles, we can. They're types of leaders, name them what you will, but there's 3 main ones that are a part of transformational theory. First, you have transformational leadership, or a transformational leader. Then we have transactional, and then we have pseudo. When we say something pseudo, what do we mean by that? When we put that little, what do you call it?
Prefix.
Prefix, yeah, girl. When you put that prefix in front of something, what are we saying about it? So we might have news, and then we might have pseudo news. What would you substitute pseudo for?
Bad news?
Fake. Fake.
Oh, fake.
Okay, so pseudo might be fake, so it looks like it on the outside, but it's not really it, okay? So again, it's this idea of, and this kind of goes off of the idea of the toxic triangle or destructive leaders. A lot of times destructive leaders, most of the time, are pseudo-transformational leaders. So we'll talk about that. So again, transformational leadership, it's all about the process that changes and transforms people. So this leadership theory, again, you notice it's more about the process than it is about telling you what to do. It's looking at an organization and saying, oh my goodness, this person came in and they were the leader, and all of a sudden the organization changed. People were transformed. Attitudes were different. People feel differently about what's going on. They're enthusiastic, or they got everybody to buy into the vision. How is that? And it's because we're trying to describe the process of how this person influenced that change and created transformation. And because of that, because we're dealing with change, change doesn't just happen with what people do. In order for people to change what they do, a lot of times their beliefs and their values have to be affected. So that's why we're going to talk about things like emotions, values, ethics, long-term goals, motives, all of that. All these things we've talked about or haven't talked about yet when it comes to followers. When we've talked about like followers' needs before, what things have we talked about? Or how have we described followers in leadership theory so far?
We talked about like how much they're committed to like the common goal in the organization.
Mm-hmm. So commitment, competence, right? Can they do the job? We haven't really talked about their emotions or their feelings yet, or what their personal goals are, really. So transformation or transformational leadership theory really starts to view people as a whole human being and not just a bunch of people that come to work to make an organization profit. Okay, that's one big difference with it. The only hesitation I'll give to you, and this is one of my critiques of transformational leadership, to me it's almost sometimes can appear to go a little bit backwards in the sense that it's still assuming that there is a leader who is being transformational. What's that sound a lot like when we're putting a person on a pedestal?
Like a manager.
Like a manager, but also what? What started us talking about trait theory? Great man theory. So it has a little bit reminiscence of great man theory, assuming that we need a person to come in and save the day, right? So just kind of sit with that for a little bit. Like, again, I really like transformational leadership, but sometimes we do have to think, is that still what we want? Do we still want to be operating in a world where we just put a person on a pedestal and kind of attribute every success to them? Just something to think about. Okay. Here again, this idea, we'll have this in your slides. We're influencing and motivating followers rather than telling them what to do. And so because we're changing their beliefs and values, we're creating more buy-in to the organization. And we do see this connection with charisma. So and the chapter talks about it. It's really important, if y'all haven't read the chapter, to go back and read it. They talk about charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership is its own separate theory. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about it because it does have some similarities with transformational leadership, but there's different components to it. And so just know that oftentimes a transformational leader can get confused with being a charismatic leader. But a charismatic leader doesn't mean someone's a transformational leader. Does that make sense? Do you think a leader can be transformational without being charismatic? Why are you saying yes?
Not everybody responds the same way to charisma.
Yeah. Would you say you're a person that doesn't respond the same to charisma?
No, because I'm mostly the charismatic person.
Yeah. I sometimes hesitate. Yeah.
I think people with like extrovertedness and charisma, at least like ideally with like leadership theories, and a lot of times, like at least in my life, the most like impactful and the most like, I don't know, the people who make the most like changes in me and like make me better are often the introverted ones.
Yep.
So they're not necessarily the most like enthusiastic, like outwardly expressive, but they make like the biggest change.
Absolutely. So yeah, with charismatic leadership, there's a strong connection with extroversion, and this assumption that you must be an extroverted person to be charismatic, which doesn't leave room for over half of our population, right? Transformational leadership, that's not a requirement to it. There's some admittance that charisma can bring about transformation, but it's not a requirement for it. So just kind of know that charisma is a little bit part of the influence process in transformational leadership, but we don't hang our hat on it. And so just, again, these are kind of two things that get confused a lot. Make sure and go back and read that part in the chapter so that you understand that. The last bullet here says that, again, we're connecting this idea of motivation, so understanding why people do the things that they do and knowing who our followers are. But look at that word. We're concerned about motivation and the morality. This is the first time that we're talking about morality in a leadership theory. What is morality? Your values, your beliefs. So you're, and most people, I would say everyone, has a set of morals, right? Because they have a set of belief and values that they're functioning off of. Even if people say they don't have a belief, that's a belief in something, right? And so we're understanding that that is a key component to how people make decisions and, again, why they do the things that they do. Why, again, let's talk about this. If we look back at the history of leadership theory, transformational theory started to be talked about in the mid-1980s. I know it's before y'all were born. I'm 1987, whoop whoop. But anything happened in the late 70s, early 80s that would make people now say, we need to be concerned about the morality of the people who are leading us? Civil rights.
The war.
Cold War.
There we go.
The Cold War, absolutely. Nixon. Okay. There, prior to this, there wasn't as much conversation about morality of people and who was leading. We kind of considered leadership to be an amoral thing. That you have good leadership or you have bad leadership. It's effective or it's ineffective. And now we're saying, maybe we should be concerned a little bit more about morality. Today, 2020, do we care about morality in our leaders?
I don't know.
I did not intentionally mean for this to be on election day. But we talk a lot about that, sometimes more than people's actual policies, right? And so the reason we care about morality is, again, if we can know what a person's beliefs and values are, maybe that can make us understand the types of decisions they might make moving forward. Because again, leaders get in these ethical situations, right? That they've kind of got to decide what ethical theory they're succumbing to and going to use to judge their decisions. And so we need to have a little understanding of morality. There's 4 components to transformational leadership. And again, these components, it's not so much like these are things that leaders have to have. We're not describing leaders now. We're describing the process. Again, like how do you know transformational leadership is happening in an organization? It's happening if you can go in and observe an organization and kind of see these things happening. Those 4 things, and I call them the 4 I's. So if you're looking for a way to try to remember them, know that they all start with I, and you can kind of come up with an alliteration to remember them. The first one is being idolized influence. So within an organization, transformational leadership's happening if there's a sense of idolized influence, meaning that there are strong role models in this organization, people who are considered to have high morals, that people look to and want to replicate. Who in your life would you consider to have idolized influence over you, that you look to as a role model? Mother Teresa, Bailey Hyde. No. Sorry, Bailey, that's going to be just like the theme that continues the rest of the semester. But no, everyone's kind of got someone in their life. Who in your life would you say, yes, they're an example of idealized influence?
Probably like a mentor.
Yeah.
Someone who like leads you really closely.
Absolutely. Any type of mentor that you might have. I think of my Nana, right? Like, she was just the strongest role model for me. I thought she had a really high standard of morals and ethics. And maybe I don't always agree with them, but she was consistent, and I like consistency, and I can appreciate a person who's consistent, right? The second component is this idea of inspirational motivation. So this is kind of the one component that, like I said, can kind of get confused with charisma a little bit. You don't have to have charisma to have inspirational motivation. And you know that inspirational motivation is there when people set high expectations, right? Like they don't just expect people to achieve the low bar. They actually cause people to rise up to higher expectations, to do more than what they were expected to do. And again, they have this tendency to be able to appeal to your emotions. So that idea of effectiveness, so reaching people's emotions and feelings, they're really good at that. Any leader you can think of who probably had inspirational motivation? How many of y'all maybe you've read it, but have actually sat and listened to the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King? Listen to the audio of it. Okay, I don't know about y'all. I've listened to it 2 or 3 times a year because we use it in some of our classes. I cry every time. Martin Luther King could speak in a way with inspirational motivation. It got to your emotions. It gets to you. That's a really good example. So again, when you're trying to think of examples yourself to remember for these components, think of things like that. That just when they speak, it cuts right at you. Okay? This is going to sound super cheesy, but do y'all remember when the Black Eyed Peas came out with the song, Where's the Love? Take me back, was it 2010? I don't even remember a long time ago. right? Like that would be a good example of inspirational motivation. Okay?
God made a farmer's speech.
Yeah, that's another good one. Yeah.
All ag majors should know.
That's another good example. I mean, it just cuts through you. It gets even if you don't want to be an emotional person, you feel something. You get a little bit of chills. Okay. Intellectual stimulation. So transformational leadership is happening when you can see that there's creativity and innovation going on. That we're not stuck in the mud. We're not dealing with status quo. We're not going back and doing things just because that's how it's always been done or what was done in the past. We're saying, let's think about things a little bit differently. Who do you know in your life, or is there an example of someone that you're like, yeah, they spur intellectual stimulation? They make people want to be more creative and innovative.
I think teachers try to do that.
How so?
Well, not all of them are good at it, but some of them try.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say my chemistry professor did very well at that, but I think, especially in the ag department, that all teachers try to inspire that innovation because we're faced with the challenges that we have now, and that's what we use as our case studies to be ready for the future, to like continue to innovate the situation at hand.
Absolutely. You know, maybe these leaders don't give you a rubric for everything you're supposed to be doing or step-by-step instructions. They kind of just say, here's a task. Go at it, right? They allow for that creativity and innovation to happen. A popular example of this would be Steve Jobs with Apple. So again, he had some quirks. I don't know that I would call him a transformational leader, but he's definitely a good example of intellectual stimulation in the sense of how the culture he created in Apple in the 80s and 90s allowed for people to be creative and innovative. And that's why we have a lot of the products that we have today. And so what does the opposite look like? How do leaders not stimulate innovation and creativity?
Rules and lots of deadlines.
Rules, lots of deadlines.
I know, just like putting you into like, I think, yeah.
Yeah. I told you to make widgets. That's all I want you to do. Don't try to tell me how to make the widgets better. Just do your job, right? So there's just no room for change. Again, if you've taken change theory, probably the opposite of a change agent. Okay. And then the last one is this idea of individualized consideration. So we are pulling back in some of our thoughts about being relationship-based and not so task-oriented here. But an organization is transformational, or transformational leadership is happening when you see that the climate is supportive, individuals feel like their needs are being met, and really they kind of see their bosses more as coaches than so much a boss or a manager. Any examples of that individualized consideration?
I think of my boss at the pig farm. He's really good about that because we have all different levels of like experiences and we all have different things going on in our life, and he knows when to be harder on some people rather than others about things, and he does a really good job of that.
That's a really good example. Yeah. Any others?
Probably someone who like, if the team is like specifically a bit smaller, someone who like will meet with every team member on like a frequent basis and is really concerned about like you as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. So rather than just saying, hey, I'll meet with the team once every 2 weeks, they take the time to maybe hear some concerns of the individuals. That helps with conflict resolution sometimes too, right? So the 4 I's, very important to transformational leadership. So here's where we pull that ethical theory back in. Can we have someone, a leader, who appears to be spurring those 4 I's in an organization, but they're unethical? Does that happen? Do we have leaders who have inspirational motivation, who have individual consideration, all those things, but we could say they're acting unethically. Is that possible? It could be manipulative, right? They could be using their influence to manipulate. So it might look like individual consideration, but they're actually manipulating people. It could look like inspirational motivation, but it's actually manipulation, okay? This is what we call that idea of pseudo-transformational. So on the outside, it looks like all the things transformational leadership would be, but their motives are different. It's self-serving. They're not really encouraging independent thought. So thinking about intellectual stimulation, like you may think that you are being creative and innovative, but really they've manipulated you into thinking that was your idea. Does that ever happen? Yeah. Right? So we have to be very careful about that. And ultimately, it's unethical because they don't really care about the common good. Okay? Any ideas of who a pseudo-transformational leadership might be? Someone that we would say was motivating, stimulating, showed consideration, but ignored the common good in the process. Who's my favorite example of this? Hitler. All right, we talked about him a little bit as a toxic leader, a destructive leader, right? It's always the ultimate example. But technically, if we weren't considering ethics and morals in this, we could say Hitler was a transformational leader. But because we do have that morality and ethics point, we're like, no, he was pseudo-transformational. Because the things that he did, while it was motivating, it was amoral. Okay, it didn't include things for the common good. If any of y'all are history people, I have included links for y'all in Canvas. Y'all are not required to watch it, but I found this interesting. There was a series, there's 3 parts to it on the History Channel, and I promise it is actually good. But if you're wanting a really good case study to look into this idea of like what is a pseudo-transformational leader, what does a destructive leader look like, and like how could someone like that get into power? The series that was called The Dark Charisma of Hitler, so the dark side of leadership. And it is it's like a different viewpoint of the history of Hitler through a leadership lens. And so you could watch it and you'll be able to see parts of the toxic triangle. You'll be able to see this idea of him showing the 4 eyes of transformational leadership and yet it not being ethical. And so again, instead of binge watching Schitt's Creek, you might watch these 3 episodes if you're doing something. Sorry, I've been on a Schitt's Creek binge lately. Anyways, so those are there if you want to watch them. So then that brings us to our 3rd style of transformational leadership, which is transactional. So essentially consider this, pseudo-transformational would be the complete opposite. Transactional leadership is a little bit more like the manager. So rather than being a leader, it's a little bit more of being the manager. And it's this idea that, if you have an organization that transformational leadership isn't happening, then you probably have an organization that transactional leadership is what's guiding the process. And it's because we're going back to this idea of rewards and feedback. So extrinsic motivators, which only work in the short term, right? I hope y'all like my meme.
I saw this TikTok the other day, and it was like POV, like you're watching your professor find a meme from 2010 to put in their PowerPoint, and the cat meme laughed.
You're welcome. I didn't get it in 2010 though. This would have been 2019. But ultimately, it's this idea that the leader's trying to be influential, and they're using motivation, and they may be moral, but again, it's not so much about the common good. It's more about their needs or the organization's needs. And there's 2 really components to it. And it's this idea that because transformational leadership isn't happening, we don't really see the 4 eyes going on. Instead, we either see contingent reward happening or management by exception. Contingent reward. What does contingent mean? Just think of the word if. You're going to get this if you do this. Okay? Contingent. So it's only going to happen if you do what I want. So transactional leadership is going on when an organization is functioning in the sense that they're only going to reward people if they behave the way they want them to behave. If they do the work that they want them to do. Not just because the people working for them may be good people. Can you think of any examples of what a contingent reward might look like in an organization?
Bonuses.
Bonuses. You're only going to get a bonus if you meet this certain sales quota. You're never going to get a reward just for doing the job you've been hired for. You got to go above and beyond, right? So contingent reward. What would be another example?
Like when you donate plasma, the eighth donation or the fifth donation, you get a $60 bonus. So
Yeah.
Going back.
Oh yeah. So if you do this so many times, we'll pay you extra. Yeah. A little bit of an incentive. Right.
Yeah, they're like 16 years.
Yeah. So then aside from contingent reward, we have this other thing of management by exception, which is simply, it's a little bit like laissez-faire leadership in the sense of, I'm not going to step in until something happens. It's reactive management versus proactive management. So management by exception. I'm not going to give you feedback as a manager unless you're doing something wrong. Any of y'all ever worked in a work environment like that? Yeah. Sometimes you just want to be told you're doing a good job, right? But then you have the boss who never says that. And then the one day you walk in 5 minutes late, that's all they can focus on, right? It's a write-up, yeah. Management by exception. So I'm only really going to act like a boss when I'm needing to punish or show consequences for something. Yeah. Huh?
That's a good math.
Have you lived through that?
All three of us have.
Okay.
It's like mini Hitler in a women's party.
It happens. It happens. And so we see this idea again of laissez-faire leadership coming up. It's not a fourth style of transformational leadership theory, but we do just need to admit that we could have neither transformational leadership or transactional leadership happening. There could be a complete absence of it. Yeah, I like this little cartoon. He who leads least leads best. Do some people have that mentality? Completely hands off? Do you like it or do you not like it?
I think it depends on the task.
Right. And we talked about that before with laissez-faire leadership, that there are some situations where it's appropriate. When is laissez-faire leadership appropriate? When the followers are competent at what they're doing, they've been doing it for a while, they don't really need you to step in and micromanage them, right? Like they may have worked at the bank longer than you've been a branch manager, right? So you can be a little hands-off. When does laissez-faire leadership not work?
And there's like a big new change within an organization or company. People don't really know what's happening yet.
Yeah. In big organizations, it's just not ideal to think that there can't be some form of leadership, right? Like one of the big shifts we see in organizational structures right now is that we're reducing the amount of hierarchy because we see that that causes a lot of red tape and it's just kind of unnecessary at times. But then some people will go to the opposite extreme and say, we need absolutely no CEOs, absolutely no board members, absolutely no regional managers. Everybody just work. Could that work for a small company with like 4 people?
Yeah.
Sure. But when you have hundreds, thousands of employees, you need a little bit of structure, a little bit of leadership there. Okay. So this chart, it's a good one to copy down from the slides when you print them off online. That just kind of gives you the components of each of the 3. You'll notice pseudo-transformational is not on here because pseudo-transformational is essentially transformational without morals and ethics. Okay? And then it tells you what the relationship between leaders and followers look like, and then kind of the expectation, the results, what we see happening in organizations. And so you'll notice here, when we don't have leadership, we have decreased outcome, right? When we just say everybody can fend for themselves, people will be motivated on their own. They will buy in and do whatever. We actually see this lack of accountability, and we actually, again, see the bar get lowered a little bit in organizations. Transactional leadership, we'll still get what we expect, but it's going to be baseline, right? But what we happen to see in these transformational organizations is that they are performing way above the current expectations. And I think, that's one of our goals in leadership is how can we help people see their own potential and do more than what that potential is. Again, we're tying into motivation, tying into feelings, tying into morals and ethics there. You do want to look at, again, the chapter talks about some strategies. For purposes of class today, though, we're not going to focus too much on there. I want us to watch this video that is a really good case study in transformational leadership. So if you don't already have out a sheet of paper taking notes, I would like for you to pull out a sheet of paper. And as we watch this TED Talk, so this is a really good TED Talk, I want you to be looking for those components, either the 4 I's of transformational leadership, or look for the 2 components of transactional leadership. So you might have those notes kind of sent to the side. So you're looking for transactional leadership. You're either looking for contingent rewards or management by exception. Transformational leadership, you're looking for the 4 I's. Any of y'all heard of Ricardo Semler before? Ooh, y'all are going to like this then. So especially, again, it has kind of an education background to it. So I think y'all are going to find he's a businessman who got into education, okay, and has really helped transform an education system. I'm interested to see what y'all think after watching. Let's make sure we got some volume here.
On Mondays and Thursdays, I learn how to die. I call them my terminal days. My wife Fernanda doesn't like the term, but a lot of people in my family died of melanoma cancer, and my parents and grandparents had it. And I kept thinking one day I could be sitting in front of a doctor who looked at my exams and says, Ricardo, things don't look very good. You have 6 months or a year to live. You start thinking about what would you do with this time. So you say, I'm going to spend more time with the kids, I'm going to go visit these places, I'm going to go up and down mountains and places, and I'm going to